Welcome to the Snapshots podcast, hosted and run by the Global Health Working Group as part of the British International Studies Association. This podcast gathers the personal insights and interests of global health practitioners through conversations with those at its cutting edge. My name is Christopher Long, co-convenor of the BISA Global Health Working Group, Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the University of Sussex, and the host and production manager of this podcast. This episode, we are speaking with Anne Roemer-Mahler, Associate Professor at the University of Sussex. Welcome, Anne, to the Snapshots podcast.
Thank you, Chris, for inviting me.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. So I guess just to begin with, so how did you find yourself working in the great area of global health?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I think I got into the area of global health a bit by accident, really. My PhD was in my PhD, I looked at conflicts between or within an industry, within the pharmaceutical industry. And I was interested in how conflicts within an industry between companies can shape politics. And so, yeah, I looked at the pharmaceutical industry and particularly the conflict between generic companies that produce generic medicines, and especially in India, and pharmaceutical companies that are developing new medicines, which are predominantly based in the West, in Western Europe, in the US. And to be honest, at that time, I wasn't particularly aware of that a field like global health existed. That was sort of in around 2008, 9. I was, as far as I was concerned, I worked on intellectual property rights, international trade politics, and global health as a field was really not on my radar at all. But that perception really changed first through interviews I did in India, where I spoke to people who were involved in the Access to Medicines campaign. And I realized that actually what I was looking at in terms of political economy and trade and intellectual property had, for many other people, actually was not about trade, it was about health. And then similarly, when I started to present my PhD work at conferences, ISA, BISA, I met people who worked on global health. I met Stefan Elbe, I met Sophie Harman, and sort of started to realize actually there are people who work on international relations in the field of health. And so that sort of sparked the interest. And I think what really was sort of a bit of an aha moment is I had thought of health as really not so I think one of the reasons why I didn't think about that I worked on health was because for me, health wasn't a particularly political field. So I was doing IR, international relations. My background was in political science. So health never featured because I think for many people, including myself at the time, health was a technical field, a scientific field. It wasn't a political field. And through the interviews I did, and then through meeting people from the IR community who worked in global health, I started to realize actually how deeply political health was. And that's then, I guess, ultimately what sparked my interest, is to realize, wow, there's actually an area that is so deeply political, which I hadn't had on my radar at all before.
Well, yeah, that's really fascinating, and it's really interesting to see how you kind of came to the field through your engagement with various other people and practitioners. It's really interesting.
I think that's also but I think it's also what like some other people in IR came to health. I mean, it's a relatively still recently new field, and a lot of people who started to study global health in IR previously did something else, studied security or trade. So I think it's quite a common trajectory actually for that generation of researchers, I think.
Yeah. So starting in maybe a more traditional, in inverted quotes, discipline, and then finding actually, there's a body of work and people working on similar connecting issues in what you would call global health. Yeah, it's really interesting. Thank you. And I guess, so what's some of the most important issues and questions that you've kind of investigated in this area and in your work?
I guess perhaps one of the most, that still think is still an important area is the issue that I did my PhD on is, and then later also postdoctoral work, and is the sort of this dual role of the pharmaceutical industry as, on the one hand, having a private mandate sort of to generate profit, to produce products that can be sold for profit. So on the one hand, like a very private mandate as a private commercial company, but on the other hand, having what I consider a public function, which is really contributing quite a lot to the health of the population, and therefore all other areas, many other areas of society as well, like people's ability to live a happy life, to work, to be productive, to for the security of countries. You have it. So I think this is this tension between the pharmaceutical industry having a private mandate and what I consider a public function. And I think this tension, or this what I think is a bit of a disconnect, is become very obvious now, obviously in the COVID pandemic, where with the fact that that COVID vaccines and other medical technologies were very much available, mostly to those who live in wealthy societies or had sort of money. But I think it's much more far-reaching. It's this disconnect between the fact that medicines and other technologies as well, it's not limited to medicines, can be life-enhancing, greatly improve people's life on the one hand. On the other hand, having a society that really has delegated the distribution of these technologies largely to commercial forces. So I think that's sort of one of the areas that I think is very relevant, that I spent in one way or the other looking at in my work. And perhaps more recently, an issue that has sort of featured quite strongly in my thinking is, I don't know how to call it, perhaps sort of the end of the global health governance era. So, or perhaps even more strongly, the end of the global health era, the era of global health. It's not an issue that I have sort of set out to study. It's actually something that I've stumbled across more in the context of another piece of research I did before the pandemic hit, when we looked into the development of a new international health organization in Africa, the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Africa, CDC. And I think it soon became clear to us, like when I say us, I mean like myself and 3 colleagues who I worked with on this. I think it became soon clear to us that what we were looking at was actually not just the emergence of a new organization, but through the lens of, through studying this, I think we felt we were studying quite fundamental changes in the field of global health. And I still remember an interview we did quite at the beginning, I think it was in 2018, with someone who said, I think that the challenge for you guys will be to understand that this is not just about the emergence of the Africa CDC, but it's about much wider changes in the field of global health. And I think what we sort of realized is that the creation of this new organization fell at into a time where it looked like, when the Africa CDC was established, it was in 2017, it looked like a bit of a heyday of global health governance. It was after the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, and global health security really had made it onto the international political agenda big time. It was on the agenda of the G7, G20. And the Africa CDC also was supported by so many different countries, not just the US and the UK, sort of the usual suspects, but it was supported obviously by many African countries. It is part of the African Union, but also by China. China actually signed a memorandum of understanding with the United States to support this new organization. So it seemed like everyone had sort of gathered behind the idea of global health and global health security. That was 2017. And now you look at where we are currently, and it feels like there's not really much left of the idea of global health governance. I mean, you have massive geopolitical conflict between China and the US, but also much more conflict internationally generally. You look at the COVID response, where it was sort of clear how limited international collaboration on health actually was. If you just look at how difficult it was for many people in Africa to get access to PPEs, to testing kits, to vaccine, and later. So like just 5 years later, it feels coming from what looked a bit like a heyday of global health governance to a complete sort of crumbling of the field, and sort of trying to understand actually what happened here. How could this happen? That for me, I think, is sort of an area that I'm now thinking about quite a bit, which I think is one of the other big issues for me that I worked on.
Great, yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess kind of you outline these two areas of kind of the dual role of the pharmaceutical industry in producing medicines, but also obviously acting for profit, and this kind of the way in which, you know, this role leads to certain political issues in the field of global health, and then actually the issue of cooperation in the international arena around, and obviously it's been shaken with recent events. So I guess with these two areas, have they connected at all, or have you just kind of found yourself interested in certain things?
That's interesting. And I think initially they were quite separate. So once I had finished project on the role of pharmaceutical companies in sort of global health security, medical countermeasures, I embarked really on a new project together with a completely different set of people. And we were trying to understand where the Africa CDC had emerged from, and sort of more linked to questions of health security in Africa. So not looking at pharmaceutical technologies or pharmaceutical industry at all. That it was in the course of this research that we encountered, we spoke to a lot of people who had very different ideas of what the right political order should be to govern health, who really didn't share the notion of globality, that sort of health is global, or this idea of global health was not shared or very much or challenged. And so it was more about questions of order and governance, that project. But then now when I look at a lot of the conflict and the challenges that have materialized in this area, a lot of them are again about the distribution and access to medical technologies. And the Africa CDC itself is now very much part of these new developments around changing the rules of pharmaceutical manufacturing in Africa, and pushing for technology, sharing of technology. So in a way, sort of, it feels like the circle has closed, and I'm back to the role of pharmaceutical companies in health, and that now in the midst of what looks like a changing field of global health governance, and the question of how much global is left in this field, how much governance is left in this field. But the question of how do we distribute key technologies seems to be at the center of many of those debates.
Oh yeah, that's really, really interesting how these two areas kind of work together, and how they've kind of evolved in your research. I guess in your experience working in these areas, have you kind of revealed any kind of really preconceived myths or disconnects, or in how kind of global governance and distributions of technologies and the role of pharmaceutical companies kind of works in reality, as to oppose maybe some of the thoughts you had going in?
I think so. I had several of moments where I felt that I've sort of that my work has helped reveal sort of disconnects or myth, but more predominantly with myths and that I had held myself, and perhaps therefore as reflecting probably much sort of more widely held myths, like the first one being, as I said earlier, how political a field health is. That was one of was the first one. And actually, I now see the politics in and around health everywhere. And I need to remind myself now that most people still consider health a very technical, scientific field that's dominated by biology and medicine. So I've now feel like, I need to remind myself that still most people think about health in a very different way that I do. Another of those myths that I feel I really feel my work has helped me see different perspective is the questioning whether the way that our societies have organized the development and production of medical technologies, whether this is the only way. Does it really have to be a private sector-led endeavor? And in the course of my research and also research we did together, we've seen sort of so many, or quite a few cases where actually the public sector is playing a very important role in the production, development of new medical technologies. So again, when I started this work, it wouldn't have even occurred to me to question whether pharmaceutical development could be organized differently. And I think through this research I've done, you've done, others have done, actually that's another of those. And I think that's also something that, I mean, this work has been going on for at least a couple of decades now. And I think it's very slowly now making itself into a more mainstream political debate that there are actually alternative ways of organizing pharmaceutical R&D. And I think another, well, probably the most recent one where I feel like my work has helped me sort of see something differently is this notion of global health. Like for the first 10 years of my career, or perhaps a bit less of that, but I sort of spent so much time thinking about trying to understand how this idea of health being global, how that had emerged and why it had emerged and what implication it has had for institutional development. And then spending quite a bit of time working with colleagues from other parts of the world, from China and from Africa, and doing interviews with people there, being frankly quite shocked by how many people either didn't agree with the idea that health was global, that there was anything like global health governance. So either didn't agree with these ideas or simply didn't understand what I was talking about. So that was another where I felt like, oh, wow, I've really grown up and grown into this narrative of global health, and then found myself realizing that this narrative wasn't shared by many others.
Well, yeah, that's really fascinating kind of insight into, some of the ways in which, the politics around global health has not, is definitely not so as widely conceived as some of us who work in the area. It's not so much shared with other people, and different perspectives around the world around just this idea of cooperation around global health. Is definitely contested, and that's really interesting. And I guess you've already talked about some of, maybe that was also a surprise in your research, right? You're surprised by these different perspectives and stuff. Is there any other surprises that you found in your research? Is, from, I guess, you talked about one of the understandings of global health as being very political and cooperative and not necessarily shared, but is there any other kind of surprises?
Another one was perhaps how difficult interdisciplinary research is. So I've always, since my PhD, I've been very interested in interdisciplinary research, and it's something I've always wanted to do. And I think I've tried actively to find people to work with who come from different disciplines. And the last sort of two small projects I've worked on were with in both cases, very interdisciplinary teams involving people with backgrounds in sociology and public health and microbiology and physicians, medical physicians. And there was a lot of, and still is a lot of enthusiasm about working together, and a lot of effort, but also having done these two projects, I realized actually how many practical difficulties arise in doing that, and especially when crossing the boundaries between some of the more social and more natural sciences, even developing a shared sort of research question, or developing an idea of what a research design could look like that combines different disciplinary approaches to address one common question, was incredibly hard work, and we actually didn't succeed properly. I mean, it always ended up in a situation where either the medics microbiology took the lead, and then there was sort of a few issues where the social scientists contributed some additional sort of angles, or it was the other way around, where it was essentially a social science project, and then we had sort of a medic or a microbiologist helping out with sort of some issues. But finding a way of actually bringing it together on equal footing, we haven't been able to do, and then not to speak of all the difficulty of finding then outlets for publications, like finding a journal that would take a mixed paper, finding reviewers who were able to review a paper that is part microbiology and part international relations. I mean, there's sort of so many practical difficulties. And that was another big surprise. I still think it's a very worthwhile endeavor, and there's so much enthusiasm. It's the worth sort of trying to keep doing it, but I'm a lot less optimistic about its potential, at least at the moment, with so many trajectories and infrastructures set up the way they are, than it was perhaps sort of 7-8 years ago.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially in the field of global health, where you have so many different elements, right? About the policy element and the scientific element, and then the political element, and then bringing those things together. That's really interesting about how some of the difficulties you faced. I guess, have you found working turning towards maybe theories? Have you found any particular theories or very powerful in your work and illuminating, or particular approaches?
It's really hard for me to single out one here, because for me, I guess fundamentally, I'm really sort of guided by empirical questions. And for me, my interest in theory is that that sort of the value of theories for me lies in their ability to reveal something, to allow me to see something that I hadn't seen before. And there's so many concepts and theories I've encountered and worked with that have allowed me to see things I hadn't seen before. That it's hard for me to single out one. I mean, concept that I keep coming back to is that of power. I find it endlessly fascinating. The many dimensions of power, how power operates, how we can study it. I guess perhaps one concept that I worked with and worked on at the very beginning of my academic work, and that I seem to be coming back to a little bit now, is that of business conflict. So the idea here is that that political developments are quite often shaped and sometimes even triggered by conflicts that arise within the business community, between companies, between industries, and then translate into wider sort of political dynamics. And that's sort of the concept I started to work with to understand what was happening within the pharmaceutical industry and the conflict between pharmaceutical companies that develop new drugs and pharmaceutical companies that develop generic medicines, and how it was really a conflict between these two parts of the industry that shaped to a very significant extent international regulation of intellectual property, and therefore the global governance of access to medicines, if you want. But the original conflict arose within the industry between, and it was a conflict about competition, about market power. And I think, given like that we live in a most of the world live in essentially capitalist systems where really most parts of our lives are penetrated by commercial dynamics. Key political questions like how resources are allocated and distributed, who has access to what ideas dominate. A lot of these really fundamentally political questions are shaped by commercial dynamics, by decisions that are made between companies and industries about what to produce, what not to produce, what standards to adhere to, what standards not to adhere to, which standards they agree on and not agreed on. So very technical, very commercial questions that can lead to tensions within the business community, but they have very fundamental political repercussions. And I think for me, that's a field that actually there's a lot more music in that, but it would require researchers of politics, of international relations to get a much better understanding actually of these commercial dynamics. But with the rise of technologies and the penetrations of data and technologies in all areas of life, I think it becomes ever more relevant to understand this interface between the commercial world and the political world a bit better, including in health.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I think, especially with the rising global health of public-private partnerships and things like this, just the role of businesses and the dynamics within them become ever more important. It's really interesting.
Yeah, and it's also it sort of, I think it requires us to be aware of this sort of dichotomy that has been created in sort of Western liberal thought between the public and the private sphere, how deeply that has penetrated the way we see the world and what we consider as part of the political world and part of the private, and is still, so there's a tendency to still, even though there's much more acknowledgement today than it was 20 years ago about the importance of non-state actors, of businesses, for politics, but I think the starting point, there's still a tendency to look at state versus companies, or the private sector versus public interest. And I think in order to get a more nuanced understanding of what's going on here, we actually need to get across this sort of this heuristic device of public-private and understand a bit more the intricacies of how these worlds are connected.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess finally then, just what are your thoughts on some of the kind of most exciting and interesting and kind of high priority issues in the field as we move forward? I mean, is this work on maybe the public-private an area you think is really interesting, or?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many, and there's so many areas I find fascinating and could imagine or could see myself work on. Specifically from where I am currently, I think what I'm following with particular excitement, from an academic perspective at least, is I think the transition from one era to the next. I see it at least that way. I think we have left an era where we used to speak about global health, the global health governance era. And I think we've now moved into an era that is different. And I think we still lack, in some ways, vocabulary and tools to think about and speak about what's different. But it's definitely an era in which the notion of the global is much more difficult to make fit to what we're actually seeing, what's going on, to the realization of how different perspectives are, interests are, It's an era that is marked by international conflict. It is an era where the colonial sort of structures and features of the world, but also of particularly in the field of health, have become much more visible, called out much more frequently, challenged. So it's in a way, it's a post-colonial era, and it's also definitely a post-COVID era, where societies are coming to terms with the experience of the pandemic and also the repercussions this had as a political field. I had a conversation about this with Stefan Elber the other day, and we came up with this idea of it's a post-global, post-colonial, and a post-COVID era. And what I'm interested in is understanding what kind of political order is emerging in this era, what kind of political order that can address health issues that have a transborder characteristic. What new political order are we seeing emerge in this new era?
Wow, yeah, that's really fascinating, and all the issues that we see around today, we're really shaping the world in new and interesting dynamics, and hopefully positive ones.
Fingers crossed. But it's definitely it's a lot of the context in which health and health politics are happening has changed so dramatically, and how those bigger questions are actually then manifest themselves in questions of there we are right back into the field of international relations, how they manifest themselves in debates and issues of order and security related to health. Great.
Well, thank you so much for taking part in the Snapshots podcast. It's been great to have you on.
Thanks very much, Chris. It was a pleasure.
Thanks. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Snapshots podcast. Please see the show notes for more information on our guest.